Number one, Mendelssohn was a philosophical rationalist. He believed that it was possible to prove the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, through reason alone. And this was a view about the power of reason that Kant effectively demolished in his Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. We could argue about whether that is correct, but certainly historically it seemed correct at the time and for a long time afterwards, that sort of metaphysical proof of the existence of God was simply not possible. And Mendelssohn had given his best years to formulating such a proof, and Kant specifically addresses Mendelssohn's version and takes it to pieces. So this happened shortly before Mendelssohn's death in 1786, but if you recall, I said that Mendelssohn was ill the last few decades of his life, and he did write some works at the end of his life to respond to the charge that his friend Lessing was a Spinozist, and he returned to his proofs of the existence of God, but as he himself admitted, he was physically unable to study Kant and take on new ideas, and so he simply didn't address any of the new criticisms that had been made, but just tried to refine what he had said earlier. Second feature of Mendelssohn's thought is that what reason cannot prove should be left to what he calls common sense. And common sense gives rise, he thinks, to a natural set of religious beliefs. Any rational person who has been brought up in a good environment should arrive at roughly the same set of beliefs about God and providence and so on. And if you can't prove them, well, that's okay, because common sense should be enough. And that's what religious faith fundamentally is. And the great advantage of Judaism over Christianity for Mendelssohn is that Judaism is the religion of common sense. It does not make any claims on your belief beyond what common sense would demand anyway. Plus, it adds to that a certain historical tradition and a set of practical legal observances. This idea of faith as a kind of common sense also seemed completely out of date by the end of Mendelssohn's life. And the reason for that is the charge against his friend Lessing, that Lessing was a Spinozist, which was made by Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. And Jacobi's argument was that philosophical rationalism will lead to all kinds of disastrous consequences. And the only alternative is what he calls the leap of faith. Faith for Jacobi was not just common sense at all, and it was not really even natural in some sense. It was a sort of existential commitment, to use an anachronistic term. Bless you. It would involve a sort of rejection of all kinds of features of modern culture and the claims upon us made by modern culture in order to achieve faith. A faith which could not be rationally demonstrated at all. That was certainly not common sense. But that sort of faith as an existential commitment that you undertake became the watchword of philosophy of religion in the 19th century. And Mendelssohn he wouldn't have had any idea what that was about. And in fact, in his exchanges with Jacobi, he just does not understand what Jacobi is saying. They live in different centuries, even though they're overlapping. Mendelssohn is a man of the Enlightenment and the 18th century, and Jacobi is the beginning of the 19th, and there's really a big difference. Third, Mendelssohn had said that Judaism is, again, not a system of dogma or special beliefs like Christianity, but a system of law. Again, that may have sounded like a good idea when he said it, but first of all, it seemed to put Judaism into head-on conflict with the claim of the state. The state increasingly claimed a monopoly over law and coercive force in general. And Mendelssohn was himself cognizant of that and argued that Jews ought to give up the right of the Jewish legal system, the court system, the Beis Din, to coerce people into conforming to its judgments, as it were, in return for citizenship. But at the same time, Mendelssohn still thought of Judaism as a system of law, the law of a virtual state, which no longer existed in any particular territory. Well, I suppose one response to that was the Zionist one of actually trying to re-establish the state. But that was not yet really on the table for most people in the early 19th century. Instead, the idea that Judaism was the law of a state that didn't exactly exist and had no coercive force seemed to leave it nowhere. And in Mendelssohn's own community in Berlin, even towards the end of his life, he seemed like an antique. He was strictly observant, but the younger generation were mostly not. And as you may know, among his own children, many of them stopped being observant, and indeed, during the French occupation of Prussia, when there was a lot of pressure on Jews to show their loyalty one way or the other, and if you accepted the emancipation of the Jews, which was Napoleonic, then you were a traitor to your Prussian friends. At that time, a number of members of this elite group, and they were not in no way representative of German Jews, but this elite group, a number of them converted to Christianity, and among them were several of Mendelssohn's children, including his son, who would then be the father of Felix Mendelssohn, and so on. Right, so not all of Mendelssohn's descendants were non-Jews, but most of them were actually Christian after that. Mendelssohn didn't live to see that. But yes, but the whole so all of his ideas seemed obsolete, and this comes out in an interesting way when you compare what he said to Maimon, and as we'll see, they knew each other. But Maimon also, at a certain point in his life, studied Kant very carefully, and basically he founded what I would call post-Kantian Jewish philosophy, which has been, a number of different approaches that take into account Kant's criticism of rationalist metaphysics, and all of those approaches can be found in one way or another, hinted at or at least in germinal form within Maimon's works. And the three works that I put on the front of the handout here are the one, though he wrote other books, but these are the ones in which I think he founds modern Jewish philosophy, late modern Jewish philosophy. The first on the left, top left, is the Versuch über die Transzendentalphilosophie. That's an essay on transcendental philosophy, and I'll get to that, but it began as a set of notes on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and it came out in 1790. The second is a new edition of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, which was published by a student of Kant's called Yitzhak Euchel, who was also famous among Jewish circles for founding the first Hebrew literary journal, Hama Asef, in Königsberg, and they published this edition with Maimon's commentary. And as we'll see, I'll say a little bit more about it in a minute, but Maimon brings Maimonides into his discussion of Kant, and he brings Kant into his discussion of Maimonides, and brings about a sort of union of post-Kantian philosophy and traditional medieval Jewish philosophy. The third on the bottom is his Lebensgeschichte, his autobiography, which, as I said, is actually by far his most widely read book. The original has 10 chapters on the philosophy of Maimonides. Most editions cut that out completely. But it was clear that that's central to Maimon's understanding of his life. And I've said in the past that having Maimonides there, always available, having philosophy there on the shelf, even for someone like Maimon who had a strictly rabbinic education, is an enormous and important fact about the history of Jewish philosophy. Okay, so I'm going to... Yes. This is a very good question. Maimon, and he says this explicitly, he says, look, I grew up in Lithuania as a scholar, a Talmud scholar. My expectation was that I would find a rich father-in-law who would support me. Now, as we'll see, he left all that behind him. It didn't work very well anyway, but, and in fact that's an important fact about the economics of Jewish scholarship in the 19th century, that system failed, which led to the invention of the kollel and so on, the communal support. Maimon came to Germany but he wanted that support and never had the slightest intention of supporting himself. He lived off the Jewish community, he worked as a tutor occasionally, and eventually found a non-Jewish patron. And that's how he supported himself. But that was always his model. And as a Jew, and as we'll see, he did not convert despite his best efforts. He was rejected by the church. They didn't want him. He could not, therefore, have any sort of university position. That would not have been a possibility yet. Okay,
Is
so
that why he
yeah.
wanted to convert?
Yes. But unfortunately, he was honest enough to say so. So let's talk about Maimon's life. So now I'm on page 3, the handout number 2. So he was born in Sukovieborg, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in 1753. A bit of background here. When he was born there, this was still the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, that had been one of the most advanced countries in Europe. It was successful, to some extent economically. It seemed to have an impressive system of government, and it set out to attract Jews, Jewish immigrants from German-speaking countries. Hence the development of a large Yiddish-speaking population in the East. They were also fleeing from persecution in the West. And they were promised that it would be better in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But in the 18th century, there's tremendous decline, economic decline, so that this Jewish population becomes now mostly impoverished. There's political problems from inside the whole complicated system of election, which started to fail, and they couldn't really get anything done. And these growing empires on the borders start invading. In particular, we have Prussia, which would become Germany. We have Russia, which wanted to become an empire, and we have Austria. And in the late 18th century, there were a series of 3 partitions of Poland, which led ultimately to Poland and Lithuania ceasing to exist as independent countries for 130 years. First they divided it up between them and left a bit, and then they took a bit more, and then they took everything. Hello. Yeah, I'm sorry, I seem to run out of handouts,
That's
but
all right.
maybe you can.
Thank you.
So at the time when Maimon was growing up in Poland, it was in this state of decline. And he portrays it as an upside down world where everything is totally irrational. And by the way, that image that he gives of himself and of his surroundings really helped to create the image of the Ostjude, the Eastern European Jew, that was a very negative image for German Jews. And that Maimon also has his own interest in putting things this way, since the story of the book is how he emerged amazingly, by his own, putting himself up by his own bootstraps from this land of superstition and irrationality, and became a great thinker. So it's a bit self-serving as well. The system of Jewish self-government was declining along with Poland. At one time, the Jews had the Council of Four Lands. Each land had its own administration, going down to the Kehillah, the community level. There were elections, there were taxes, basically it was a sort of a state. And this had really fallen into decay as well. And in fact, by the 19th century, that entire system collapsed and was replaced by various other things. On the one hand, there was the possibility then of becoming a citizen of the state. On the other hand, from a Jewish point of view, there were new systems of self-government that arose. The Hasidic Rebbe's court was one, the Lithuanian yeshivas, and in Germany a different sort of communal structure, and that would take me too long to go into the details of. But Maimon is talking about a time when the system is there and in ruins, and there's nothing else yet. So he describes this. Now you've got another package of texts here. The first text, this is a bit later in the handout, he describes how he grew up on this farm, and in principle it should have been the source of wealth for his family, but it wasn't at all, because they didn't have any idea what to do with it, and neither did anybody else, and the infrastructure had fallen apart. So he describes, I think because of time I'm not going to read out everything, but there were bridges, and nobody knew how to fix the bridges, or could get them fixed. But you were responsible if it was your land. And if a Polish nobleman would come and the bridge would give way, you would be in serious trouble. So they had a totally rational response to that, which was that they had guards posted at the bridge, and if they saw a Polish nobleman sawing, everybody ran. And they just left the house and went into the woods. Yes?
But Jews could own property.
Yeah, it's not necessarily. It was a sort of a lease arrangement, but they were supposed to be running the farm, and they basically weren't. So he says that they stationed people to keep watch at the bridge, and so everyone just would run out of the house. It wouldn't have been simpler to fix it. Well, apparently not. And Maimon goes on to describe this nightmare in his childhood, which something that actually happened, where he was left behind in one of these sort of flights for the forests, and he was lost for several hours. So there's a lot of stuff about that, like that, in the book about how crazy it is to live in Lithuania at the time, in the late 80s.
How would you compare him to Heine?
To Heine. Well, Heine, living in Germany a generation later, had, first of all, the possibility of going to university, as he did.
But only if he converted.
No, he went to university without converting. That was fine. But there was the glass ceiling was when you actually wanted a university position. Now that was going back and forth, because in Prussia at the time, and he was at the University of Berlin, so under the French occupation, they had emancipated the Jews and also allowed Jews to take all offices, at least in principle. But the question was whether that legislation would be reversed when the French were kicked out, and eventually it was. It was reversed. So the Jews were sort of stranded now.
Because he said that his conversion was like a ticket.
Exactly.
To society.
Yes, he did say that. But unlike Maimon, he probably had the good sense not to say that to the priest who he was hoping would convert him. As we'll see, Maimon said exactly what he thought, and didn't always go that well. So Maimon grew up with as a Talmudist. His father was a scholar, and in the way that was typical of Jews in the area, he had an arranged marriage at the age of 11, and he has this very comical chapter about how his father, who was a bit of a scoundrel as well as a scholar, first arranged a marriage with one family, and then he thought he could get a better price somewhere else, so he made a different shidduch, and then they got into a big problem because one future father-in-law came to town but happened to stay in the same house as the other family, and then they realized he had didn't come. Yeah, and then one of the families kidnapped Maimon. This is all at the age of 11, right? And they tried to make off with the chassan, with the bridegroom. So it's all very comical, and it's not a very happy marriage that he gets into.
There was no religious foundation.
I think there was an economic foundation.
No, but there was nothing.
It's not even. It's right. There are difficulties even about the validity of such a marriage, right? From Jewish legal point of view, and that's as much discussed in the literature, because there were many times when Jews felt the economic necessity of arranging marriage for minors who are not really legally competent to get married. So there are lots of issues about that. But I'd say it's mainly economic. That was the reason why there were such things. And this was the standard story, that if you had a boy with who had shown some Talmudic ability, then he could get a good price from a wealthy family by way of a dowry. Now, in the end, it didn't work out very well. As I said, there was economic decline. So he's now married and starts to have children in his teens, and the money ran out. So he ends up trying to scrape a living in various ways. He becomes a tutor. He becomes a sort of Kabbalistic faith healer. He becomes a bit of a physician, but he doesn't really know what he's doing, and so on. And all in all, he's not very happy in this situation, but he continues to progress as a scholar, and he also starts to read scientific and philosophical works whenever he can get hold of them, which is hard. His father had some kept in a cupboard, and he used to get up in the middle of the night and read those, although he wasn't supposed to. And he says if he heard that some rabbi 50 miles away had a book on philosophy, he would walk over there and go and read it. But at this time, he studied Maimonides, he studied Kabbalah, but he did not know very much at all about developments in science and philosophy since the Middle Ages. He had read one book of modern physics, and that was it. I don't think he knew much about it. And he also thought about joining the Hasidim when they first got started. It's actually a very important historical report, because he talks about how he goes there to the court of the Maggid of Mezerich, and it's all very impressive, and the Maggid seems to have this supernatural power, and then Maimon says, he realizes that it's all a fraud, and it's some sort of crazy cult, and he says, I'm not having anything to do with them. But it's a very important report.
What made him think it was a fraud?
Well, the way it works in the story, and I would recommend reading the autobiography. It's still in print, actually. You can also find it free on the internet, to be honest, but there is an in-print version. This is not a complete English translation, which I know some colleagues of mine are working on, but the Maggid would somehow weave into his speech allusions to the individuals who had come. So they would think, oh yeah, how could he possibly know that? And Maimon figures out that he's got these sort of informants in the crowd who are finding these things out and feeding them to him, and he's putting it all together. Okay, so Maimon eventually figures, this is it. It's not working for him, this life in Lithuania. And he doesn't seem to have had an awful lot of commitment to his wife and kids. Again, he felt he was forced into the whole thing. So he leaves. And this is in 1776. Goes to Königsberg, which is in the east, then he goes by boat to Stettin, and then he goes on foot to Berlin. And he's heard about Berlin Jews and the Enlightenment and so on, and he wants to be part of it. But I mentioned this last time, that the situation in the Jewish community in Berlin was that you had to be prepared to support yourself financially and not get into any trouble, because otherwise the Jewish community would be responsible for you to the government. So the Jewish community had basically a border guard standing there who would see, if you were the right sort of person to let in or not. And Maimon was not very good at these situations and said far too much about what his real intentions were. They said, what are you coming to do? Are you coming to work? And he said, no. I'm going to write a commentary on the guide. And no, we don't want you around. So they kicked him out, both because he wasn't going to be economically viable and because he sounded like a bit of a religious troublemaker as well, as indeed he would be.
What did they do about language?
Yes.
To German?
Yeah. So, Maimon spoke Yiddish, and his Yiddish, German Jews also spoke Yiddish, but it was Western Yiddish, and it's basically, all of these are dialects of German, basically, but Eastern Yiddish is further away from High German, Hochdeutsch, than Western Yiddish. So Maimon had difficulty being understood at first. He learned the alphabet, the Latin alphabet, by comparing. He says on the copy of the Talmud that they had, it also had the names of the tractates in the Latin letters, and since he knew what the words were supposed to say in Aramaic, he could figure out what the sounds were. So he could read German. That was not too hard, but it took him a long time before he could be understood. And he says when he first got there, Mendelssohn was one of the few people who could actually be bothered to try and understand him because he sounded so foreign. But he wasn't the first Polish Jew or Lithuanian Jew to go to Berlin by any means. Okay, so he's kicked out of Berlin, doesn't get in, and basically wanders around the countryside. This is during 1778 for about half a year with a professional Jewish beggar. So he's a schnorrer for about half a year. He's got, by this point, his clothing is in shreds. He's got no money, he's got nothing at all. And he arrives in Posen, which is in East Prussia. Oh, that's Poznan now, it's in Poland. And East Prussia is way east of where we now think of Prussia as being. And he meets somebody he knows, because there were a number of rabbis who would come from Lithuania and go to these areas in the west. It's not even really that far west. Now, the previous rabbi of Posen had been someone he knew, and he had left. There was a new rabbi. However, this previous rabbi had left his son behind. His son was still at school there, and the son recognized Maimon. So the son told the present rabbi, "Oh, this guy is a great Talmudist. He's a scholar." So the rabbi then treated him with honor. He gave him money to buy new clothes. He gave him an apartment to live in, gave him food, and so on. And he said this was the happiest time of his life for a year or so. Before, as we'll see, his welcome wore thin. He was treated as a great Torah scholar, and he gave classes, although he said he offered to give classes at Maimonides, and they said no, that was too radical. But eventually did get into trouble. This is actually, text number 3, which I call the magical gefilte fish incident. Maimon was not very respectful of superstition. Following Maimonides, he thought it was a terrible thing, but he wasn't very polite about it. So it says here, another incident occurred in a Jewish house one Friday. They were preparing the fish for Shabbos. The fish was a carp, and it seemed to the cook who was cutting it up as if it uttered a sound. This threw everybody into a panic. The rabbi was asked what should be done with this dumb fish that had ventured to speak. Under the superstitious idea that the carp was possessed with a spirit, the rabbi enjoined that it should be wrapped in a linen cloth and buried with pomp. Right, so they think this fish has spoken. Occasionally you see such stories, but not usually from the Jewish world these days, although it could happen, I suppose, in some parts. Because now, in the house where I live, this awe-inspiring event became the subject of conversation. Having by this time emancipated myself pretty thoroughly from superstitions of this sort, by diligent study of the Moreh Nevuchim, that is to say, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, I laughed heartily over the story, and said that if instead of burying the carp they had sent it to me, I should have tried how such an inspired carp would taste. So there are a couple of incidents like that where he just really mocks the people, and they say, we've had enough for you, get out. So he decides to try Berlin again, and this time he's got a bit of money, so he bribes the mail coach, and he hides on there and basically avoids the border guard and gets into the city. So he gets to know Mendelssohn and various other people, and the community agrees to support him temporarily while he studies to be a pharmacist. Although they quickly realized, he says, that he had no intention of ever becoming a pharmacist, and his interest in it was purely scientific. At the same time, this is in the 1780s, he also was more and more lax in his Jewish observance. Now, he wasn't the only person, but if the community was supporting him, this became a bit more of a problem. And he fell in with a particular crowd of young men who apparently frequented what they call houses of ill repute. So he developed a rather bad reputation. And eventually the community said, look, this is no good. We're not going to support you anymore, and you're not going to make a living, so I think you should leave. And Mendelssohn was appointed to deliver the message because they were on good terms. And Mendelssohn said this in a very friendly way. But that led to a very sad part of Maimon's life, where he tried to commit suicide, but he said he just didn't have the courage to do it. He stood over at the canal in Amsterdam, so bent over, trying to throw himself in, and he just couldn't quite make himself do it. I'll come back to that in a minute, but one thing that interests me, text 4 on the handout, which is about his discussions with Mendelssohn about Jewish observance. And as I said before, Mendelssohn thought of Judaism as a legal system. And his argument was that we were committed to this legal system because God had presented it to us. And he says, until God comes and says, do something else, there we are. We are obligated to it. We're part of the Jewish state. So Maimon says, well, that sounds fine. I'm not going to read out the whole passage. He says, fine, I'll agree with that. But he says, what follows from it? Well, he says, if I'm a member of a certain state and I decide I want to leave and go and join another state, I have the liberty to do that. If I'm living in England and I'm a citizen, but I want to come to America, I should be free to do that. So he says, well, if a Jew wishes no longer to be a member of this theocratic state and goes over to the heathen religion or the philosophical, which is nothing more than pure natural religion, or what if there's a political state that would have him? Now, of course, there wasn't one, and that's the great irony of this, that there was no state that would have him. But nevertheless, from his point of view, what follows from Mendelssohn's argument is that you should be free to give up your citizenship in the Jewish state if that's the thing that you want to do, especially if you're doing it for the sake of reason, because remember that Mendelssohn's whole argument about the Jewish virtual state is that it fits the demands of reason best. So, well, if you're not adopting any non-rational views like becoming a Christian, then what's wrong with it? Interesting, he goes on to say at the end of the passage, I didn't give you the whole thing, that from his point of view, if you stay Jewish, then you ought to be observant. And he's very emphatic about that. He says, personally, I decided just to become a philosopher and a member of the Republic of Letters, shall we say. But there was no, he would have happily become a citizen of some German state if they would have had it, but they wouldn't. Now, when he went to Amsterdam, this is going to be text 5, he, out of desperation, so he'd been kicked out of Berlin, he had no source of income, he really had nothing going anymore, hadn't succeeded in committing suicide, he decided, I'm going to have to convert. And as I said, he was rejected. So here's the letter that he wrote, and all this is on his own account in the autobiography. He says he has to dictate this because he thinks that the priests will not understand his Yiddish. He says, I'm a native of Poland, belonging to the Jewish nation, destined by my education and studies to be a rabbi. But in the thickest darkness I have perceived some light. This induced me to search further after light and truth and to free myself completely from the darkness of superstition and ignorance. This takes the notion of enlightenment very literally here. In order to achieve this end, which could not be attained in my native place, I came to Berlin, where by the support of some enlightened men of our nation I studied for some years, not indeed after any plan, but merely to satisfy my thirst for knowledge. But as our nation is unable to use not only such planless studies, but even those conducted on the most perfect plan, it cannot be blamed for becoming tired of them and pronouncing their encouragement to be useless. In other words, they had enough of supporting this pursuit of knowledge, of being his father-in-law, in effect. I have therefore resolved, in order to secure temporal as well as eternal happiness, which depends on the attainment of perfection, that's his Maimonidean view, and in order to become useful to myself as well as others, to embrace the Christian religion. There's nothing about believing in Christianity, right? The Jewish religion, it is true, comes in its articles of faith nearer to reason than Christianity. That's Mendelssohn's view. But in practical use, the latter has an advantage over the former, right? Because you can get a job if you're a Christian, get someone to support you. And since morality, which consists not in opinions but in actions, is the aim of all religion in general, clearly the latter comes nearer than the former to this aim. Moreover, I hold the mysteries of the Christian religion for that which they are, that is, allegorical representations of the truth that are most important for man. Right, so I'm not going to take any of the Christian stuff literally anyway. I'm going to interpret it allegorically. By this means I make my faith in them harmonize with reason, but I cannot believe them according to their common meaning. I beg therefore most respectfully an answer to the question whether after this confession I am worthy of the Christian religion or not. In the former case I am ready to carry my proposal into effect, but in the latter I must give up all claim to a religion which enjoins me to lie, that is, to deliver a confession of faith which contradicts my reason. Now again, I have to say, all of this is written by Maimon long after the fact, and who knows what he really wrote. It's a very self-aggrandizing presentation. I don't know what he actually said. But that's the way he presents it. If you look at the next text, the pastor's response.
How common was it for a Jew to try to convert?
Not at all common. Although, as I mentioned, there were these cases in Berlin, even that was later. Conversion was very uncommon.
At this time, but
Yes.
later,
Later, it changes over the course of the 19th century. The one great exception is the mass conversion of Jews in Poland during the period of Frankism in the mid-18th century. So that was a few decades earlier. That's a very unusual, strange event.
What about the Spanish Inquisition, the forced conversion?
Yes, so that's hundreds of years before in a very different place.
What happened in England at that time?
In England, there weren't very many Jews in England yet. there was a Sephardi population, small Sephardi population that had come from Amsterdam, and there was the beginnings of an Ashkenazi community. So, the pastor says, "You are too much of a philosopher to be able to become a Christian. Reason has taken the upper hand with you, and faith must accommodate itself to reason. You hold the mysteries of the Christian religion to be mere fables, and its commands to be mere laws of reason. For the present, I cannot be satisfied with your confession of faith. You should therefore pray to God that he may enlighten you with his grace and endow you with the spirit of true Christianity, and then come to me again." "If that's the case," I said, "then I must confess, Herr Pastor, that I'm not qualified for Christianity. Whatever light I may receive, I shall always make it luminous with the light of reason. I shall never believe that I have fallen upon new truths, if it's impossible to see their connection with the truths already known to me. I must therefore remain what I am, a stiff-necked Jew." And that's the biblical expression for a certain stubbornness, which in the biblical stories is not really praiseworthy. But Maimon, that's why I said he became a sort of folk hero in the course of the 19th century, because that's his identity. His Jewish identity is to be a stiff-necked Jew, a sort of rationalist, and he's just as stiff-necked about Judaism as he is about other religions. "My religion enjoins me to believe nothing, but to think the truth and to practice goodness." Again, that's very much based on Mendelssohn. "If I find any hindrance in this from external circumstances, it's not my fault. I do all that lies in my power." With this, I bade the pastor goodbye. So that's the failed attempt. Now, at this point, his luck changed a bit. There was a gymnasium, a sort of high school, in the Hamburg-Altona area. This was now under the rule of the Kingdom of Denmark, by the way, which sometimes had accepted Jews who were not of high school age and had allowed them to study in the high school. And that's what Maimon now did. He he enrolled in this high school. I don't know what it was like for the other students, but he learned a lot of mathematics, and he learned modern physics and some other subjects there, and he learned, presumably improved his German. And he had to, in order to write his name in the register, he had to adopt a surname. He had never had one before. So in homage to Maimonides, he adopted the last name Maimon. Before that, he was just called Shlomo ben Yehoshua, Solomon the son of Joshua. So that's when he becomes Maimon. This is in 1783 to 1786. And then he returns to Berlin, and by now he'd probably changed his look altogether, shaved his beard off, probably was not observing anything anymore, and had adopted the general manners of the German population without, as I say, becoming Christian. Meanwhile, his wife is trying to track him down. She hasn't seen him for a few years. And, the poor woman is stuck. Right? He didn't give her a divorce. He didn't give her a get. And she wants him either to come back or to give her a get. And he is not very... it's one of the nastiest parts of the autobiography, I find. He basically is, since I once had some affection for her, I decided not to let it go so easily. Not very affectionate. And he gives her a really hard time. And with the Bezdin, the rabbinical court, he also gives them a hard time. They say, look, you've got to give her a get. And he says, because he knows, he's got this Talmudic background, he says, you have the power to force me to give the get. Now, rabbinic courts do have such a power, which, as you may know, they really are reluctant to use. It's a matter of last resort and very difficult to do halakhically, but it can be done. And he basically dared them and said, I know you could do it, I could give you an argument if you wanted one, force me, go on. And they get really angry with him. And eventually he gives in and gives his wife a get, and he comes back and he's in Berlin. Now he's in Berlin at the end of the 80s, Mendelssohn is dead, and he becomes friendly with a man called Marcus Hertz, who was part of Mendelssohn's circle. Marcus Hertz was a student of Kant. He had studied with, Jewish students were allowed to study medicine in some universities. In the University of Padua in Italy, that was very common for a long time, for hundreds of years. But in other universities now, it was also beginning, but they couldn't join other faculties yet. Hertz was a medical student, but he was very philosophically minded, so much so that when Kant was promoted to full professor, you had to have a sort of dissertation defense at that time, just like you do when you get a doctorate. You had to have one for all the different promotions. And you were not allowed to defend your own dissertation. You had to nominate someone to defend it for you. So Kant nominated the Jewish student Marcus Hertz to defend his views. And that was unprecedented. Kant also, when he
Unprecedented because he was Jewish, or
because
not a
he was
philosopher?
Jewish. Because he was Jewish. Kant also tried to appoint, when he was the rector of the university, Itzhak Euchel, who I mentioned before, was another Jewish student, as a teacher of Hebrew, and he was vetoed, because that would have been the first Jewish faculty member. So Hertz was by now living in Berlin. He was a very established physician, and he was actually known as a professor. He gave classes in his house. He still taught some philosophy as well, and he wrote a couple of books, and he was in contact with Kant the whole time. They were corresponding. So Kant sends him the manuscript of what we now know as the Critique of Pure Reason, the greatest philosophical work of the last 2 centuries. And Hertz says, I don't really understand it. It's really different from what Kant was doing 20 years ago when I was his student. And he gives it to Maimon to read. And Maimon eats it up and comes back to Hertz with a book-length set of notes and comments and questions. He says, can you do something with this? And Hertz says, well, I can send it to Kant. Now, Kant was not very good at reading other people's stuff, and he says to Hertz, I don't know what you were thinking, sending me this big manuscript. Yeah, Kant was teaching far more hours a week than we professors do now, and writing all this stuff. And his time was very measured. But he says, actually, I did look at it, and it's brilliant. He says, this guy understands me better than anybody else, and he asks the best questions, although I don't agree with his answers, and then he goes into detail. But now that was Maimon's sort of ticket from the rest of his life. It's the only praise he really ever had, was Kant saying he understands him best. So that eventually became Maimon's first German book, the Essay on Transcendental Philosophy. It's a hard book to read, actually, because it really is more notes than anything else, but it was very influential at the time, and it really changed the debate about Kant, and in particular it brings, this is not the place to explain the details, but it brings the Maimonidean ideas into the explanation of Kant. At the same time, he was working on his commentary on the Guide, as I mentioned, which was published by this other student of Kant's, Itzhak Euchel. And that's also very important. That was published in Hebrew, and it was read by philosophically minded Jews in Eastern Europe for the next 100 years. And it became really very important for them, because Maimon has an introduction. He says, I'm going to tell you what's been happening in modern philosophy and science since Maimonides. And he sketches the history of the scientific revolution and the development of philosophy and so on up to the present day. And then in his discussion of Maimonides, he will bring in Kant and Leibniz and Spinoza, and he'll translate from the German into Hebrew and give a long extract. And for many Jews in Eastern Europe who only read Hebrew and didn't have the books and didn't have the languages, that was the way to get into contemporary philosophy. So that was published in 1790. It also became involved in 1791 in a very interesting project. It's called Gnosis Auton, which is the Greek for know thyself. And it was the translation, obviously, from German, a magazine concerning experiential psychology for scholars and lay people. So this was what you might call empirical psychology, but it wasn't experimental. It was anecdotal. And people were encouraged to write in with descriptions either of their own lives, or episodes from their lives, or strange people, or things they had encountered, or that would be of psychological interest. And it's very interesting that the overwhelming majority of contributions to this journal were from Jews, although it was not founded by a Jew. It was founded by a man called Carl Philipp Moritz, who was from a pietist background. And there were certainly non-Jewish readers as well, but Jews, for whatever reason, and there's been some work on it recently, were very interested in this, and in writing about themselves and about the nature of the mind. Maimon became a sort of editorial assistant. Maybe it paid some money, I'm not sure. And he eventually became the editor of this thing. And it was in conjunction with that he wrote his own autobiography. This was part of a series started by Moritz of autobiographies, and the theme was enlightenment, how you go from darkness to light or from unreason to reason. So Moritz, his own autobiography is about growing up in a Christian pietist setting and then transforming. And so Maimon's book, from which I've been reading you some extracts, is very much in that mode, but it's a Jewish version of the story. And it's interesting because the previous pattern for books about the transformation of Jews written in German would have been that they were conversion stories. And that goes back to the 14th century. Jews who convert, writing books in non-Jewish languages to talk about how they have left Judaism behind. And as I said, Maimon's story is actually not that exactly. In fact, he tries to convert, but even his attempt at conversion is a rejection of Christianity. So it's no real wonder that he's rejected in turn by the pastor. His story is about Haskalah, and it's about the enlightenment of a Jew who retains a certain kind of strange, somewhat perverse Jewish identity, as I said, as a stiff-necked Jew. He left the Jewish community behind mainly because they were not supporting him financially, and that was the big problem that he had at this point. So somewhere in 1795 or thereabouts, he meets a guy, a Christian count von Kalkreut, who has an estate in Silesia, and Kalkreut admires him and says, look, come and live on my estate, I'll give you a place, and you can keep writing your books and your articles and I'll support you. So that was good enough for Maimon, and he spent the last 5 years of his life there. He was writing a fair amount, but again, without any really sort of stable audience, but he was still read. He had a serious alcohol problem, and that's clear even from his own description, but certainly from the description of others. And that was another thing that made him rather unwelcome in Berlin, because usually late at night the night watchman would be called and have to quiet Maimon down as he was coming back from the tavern shouting about philosophy. And he says that he wrote his books in the tavern, actually, with a pint of beer or whatever it was. And this clearly took its toll on him. There's been some dispute, since we don't really know whether he died of something related to alcohol or not, but his health was not good in the last couple of years anyway. We have a description of it from a man called Chegai, who was the local pastor in this little village, wherever it was, in Silesia, who started going to visit Maimon and chat about things. And Chegai, in fact, was there when Maimon died, so he describes this conversation. It's rather like the conversation that's reported with David Hume on his deathbed. Well, surely you believe now. Now you're about to die. Don't you want to convert? No, leave me alone. But actually, to be fair though, Chegai did not try and convert him to Christianity. What he tried to convert him to was belief in the immortality of the soul. And you may remember from previous weeks, that has been a big issue. Spinoza's great heresy would appear to have been denying the immortality of the soul. Even though you would think, from a Jewish point of view, that's not really an important doctrine. It's a Christian doctrine. But it may be that, first of all, it had become something of a Jewish doctrine. And secondly, I think more importantly, the Jewish community in Amsterdam was worried that they would get into trouble with the Christians if they had someone in their community who was vocally arguing about Christian doctrine. Mendelssohn, you may recall, although he regarded Spinoza as a sort of hero, also thought Spinoza was wrong, and in order to show that you could be a Jewish philosopher without being Spinoza and being kicked out, he wrote an important book called Phaedon, in which he gives a celebrated proof of the immortality of the soul, a proof which Kant demolished in his Critique of Pure Reason. So Maimon, having thought about it very hard, didn't believe in the immortality of the soul. He had originally held a more Maimonidean position, that you could attain immortality through reflection on purely rational matters. But he gives that up, and he writes about it in his very last work, which was called Critical Investigations of the Human Mind, 1797. So on his deathbed, this guy Chegai says, come on, you admire Mendelssohn, don't you want to and you're about to die. Can't you now bring yourself to believe in the immortality of the soul? And Maimon says, well, I'd like to, but no. No, I don't think so.
Stayed true to the end.
Yes, he did, to be fair to him.
He was
So-
very young when he died.
Yes, he was not
47.
very old. And he had only 10 years of real productivity, in which he published, well, in the current edition, it's about 8 volumes of works. We're going to add a 9th soon, I think, because there are some Hebrew manuscripts that were not published. So I and some colleagues are editing those, and we're hoping to put them out at some point.
Could you summarize his philosophy in these four books? What did he say?
Well,
No.
one thing to say is that he remains committed to the Maimonidean view that the goal of human life is to perfect your intellect. And he's really not interested in very much else. He's not interested in the senses at all. He doesn't have much of an aesthetics, for example. However, he takes a Kantian view insofar as he doesn't think that the intellect alone can actually prove anything. So he has a strange situation where, on the one hand, he thinks that the intellect or reason is basically mathematical. He believes in modern mathematics, which is to say calculus, basically.
So he believes in science.
He believes in science in its purely mathematical part. Applying the purely mathematical part to the empirical world, he believes, requires a series of fictitious assumptions, so that it can't really be done. So he doesn't think that physics, although it's a nice idea, has really been accomplished. And he has a book about Newton where he tries to show this. So on the one, he's got 2 different philosophical directions and he's moving in at once. On the one hand, purely mathematical, logical system. On the other hand, a sort of debunking as much as possible of ideas that seem rational but really aren't required by reason, including the ideas of science that he thinks are not the ones that don't really work, but especially popular superstition. And he says, yes, that ultimately there's a kind of conflict or of a tension between them, but you should just keep working on both sides. So he's, on the one hand, the mathematical part is really building a sort of castle in the air, and you don't know whether you're going to reach the ground or not. On the other hand, you're starting from the ground up and explaining everything in a totally different way. But if we ever did manage to establish a genuine mathematical science of nature, Maimon would be very happy with that. That's my short version.
4 volumes, 9 volumes.
Yes. But he's also a Kabbalist in his youth, and some of the Kabbalistic manuscripts which combine Kabbalah with Newtonian physics were in the process of editing. So those, and in fact, one of the most famous is called Chochmat Shlomo, the Wisdom of Solomon, which was the title of this session. Okay, great. So I thought put this off, and then I don't mind keeping talking.